Hi, I'm Eric Bigelson, the Senior Director, Head of Global Industry Engagement for the EDM Council, and also Head of the ESG Working Group. ESG is one of the biggest challenges of our time, and not surprisingly, data, standards, regulations are at the core of the discussion and debate. Today, we have an exciting panel of subject matter experts that's being hosted by Palantir, a technology company that's focused on big data. Financial Services Product Lead at Palantir, who will be the moderator of the panel, and who'll introduce the panelists from HSBC, Capco, and Palantir. Danny, I'm handing it over to you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Eric, and thank you to EDM Council for having us today. Would like to introduce panelists who are going to be moderated by myself on this exciting topic. So from Capco, we have Chris Probert, Partner and UK Data Practice Lead. My colleague, Samantha Beatty, is the ESG Solutions Lead from Palantir and joins us also today. And then from HSBC, I'm very excited to announce we have Charmaine Wong with us, who is Group Head of ESG Data and Analytics from HSBC. So now we've introduced the panel. Before I kick off and start with questions, if we pop over to the next slide, I'd like to give a quick summary of what we're going to talk through today, really set the scene based on the problem statement we're looking at. From the problem statement, how we're thinking about the complex data environment that actually characterizes the ESG world, and then the business objectives we're going to talk through today. So I think, same for many of us, last year, most of our organizations in whatever sector we may be in, financial services or manufacturing, set or strengthened our environmental and social targets. Manufacturers plan to minimize non-renewable materials along their complex supply chains. And for many of the members here today, the financial services firms aim to actually align their investments and lending with sustainable practices. I think the market is actually in agreement, and maybe lots of people here are today, which we'll find out during this panel, that financial organizations in particular face many conflicts and challenges in determining the environmental and social impact of their investments, their assets, how to report them for regulatory or corporate purposes. Now, ESG frameworks exist and are intended to be a blueprint to achieve a better and more sustainable future for all. But while they give banks a target state to measure ESG impacts, the aims are disparate, often contradictory, and the ESG data to understand and model this impact either doesn't exist or isn't standardized. So as I've said, this is just part of the complex data environment that characterizes the ESG world. We also have siloed ESG data. It does not propagate through an organization like financial or logistics data does. Data and model readiness is low in the market. Modeling and scenario analysis, if done at all, is often done in a vacuum and doesn't lead to operational decisions. And unfortunately, there's a lack of operational tooling for decision makers. So while decision makers have an insight into how their actions impact financial decisions, they can't actually quantify the ESG impact of those same decisions. So now onto the business objective and what we're going to cover today. While the multi-decade sustainability goals that we've all set are laudable, they need backing up with credible pathways. So the challenge we aim to discuss today is how to align our long-term goals with day-to-day operations using data and technology. So to kick off with our first question, and we can stop sharing slides now, I'd like to go to Charmaine and ask you what you see as your biggest pain point for banks in integrating ESG practices into their business today.
So I think we have many pain points in banks, but I think that data is definitely one of the biggest pain points. So some of the challenges that we're all familiar with, and I think you've highlighted before, and that we're seeing is that we currently have a multitude of definitions and frameworks, particularly for the S and the G part of this. There is no common definition on what metrics, thresholds, and measures are required. I've actually just read an article about ESG funds that scored higher in the scoring that was given, but didn't necessarily perform that well financially. So obviously, for us data people, this is quite challenging to provide data for. So we really need common definitions and taxonomies. So essentially, the first problem is that we have no set requirements. And obviously being a data person, we love our data requirements. So no set requirements. Second problem is that the requirements change all the time. And what is considered acceptable, especially in the society part, changes based on many different factors and definitions. So for example, data privacy wasn't considered a big thing 7, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. But now it's massive and it has to do with a breach on data privacy has a massive impact on share price. I mean, look at what happened with, I think it was last night actually, when WhatsApp and everything all went down and the share price fell a little bit as well. So we have constantly evolving requirements. So that's the sort of second challenge that we have. And the third thing is that let's just say that we have set requirements and they're relatively static and we know what data we need. The type of data that we actually need is not easily accessible internally in the banks or externally actually. And even then the data might be there, but it's on documents, newspaper clippings, structured, unstructured data, all types of data. And I think the data available also depends on the type of company, the type of customers. So there's more information on a publicly listed Western-based company, especially on the S&G side. But you're looking at an SME business in Fiji or something, it is not easy to get the data that we need. And so that's the third thing. It's not quite easy to get the data that we actually need. And the fourth thing, the data quality as well. The fourth and last thing, the data quality is always questionable, especially on this sort of topic. A lot of the data that is gathered from a lot of our vendors and a lot of these external data companies and market data on ESG, especially on the unknown side, is self-certified. So who knows? Who is the authority to certify this? We don't have that just yet. So with that, the quality of data coupled with the volume of data required is always tricky. So that's the sort of four key, there are many challenges, obviously, but these are sort of the top four, I think, that we're struggling with in terms of pain points. So I think that's it. Chris, I see you nodding a lot.
Oh, I was agreeing with everything you were saying. I think it's some really good points there. I mean, I think, at the heart of this is a data problem, and a lack of standards don't gel well with data solutions. I mean, I think it's, the ESG working group is a great example in the EDMC, and I think the CDMC launch today is a great sign of how the industry can get together around some of these problems. And I think, that's going to be a key part of driving this forward. How they work with the vendors to particularly define, you mentioned about certification. There's secondary and primary data sources here. Some organizations will take secondary data, some want to go back to primary, and working in a way to consume that meaningfully and also comparative against different vendors. I think the ESG data play is going to be a very large vendor play like it does with market and reference. And I think, it's going to take the industry to get together to put some pressure on vendors, but also regulators to get in line to some degree, which I think is going to be really important. So I was just agreeing with Ollie there, just nodding away.
And Chris, to those points in terms of the kind of four challenges that you think we could get together around, where do you think data integration and standardization sits in comparison to data availability or data quality?
I mean, it's a really good question. I think they actually, they're really important. The ability to integrate data in a non-standard world and building solutions which are future-proof. And by future-proof, I mean acknowledging a changing environment are going to be really important. If all the data was standard, all the sources were great, we would just bring it all in-house and we would make it available. I think the burden on organizations is going to be their integration layers need to be flexible. They're going to need to be work on not rigid ETL platforms, more ontological approaches where people potentially can bring that data together and refactor that data more easily in a way to deal with all that mess up in the front so they can present useful data on the back end. So I think that the kind of data integration platforms, particularly, the kind of virtualization platforms, particularly those that do it via graph networks rather than rigid rules, that's going to be a really important play in the ESG data. space to do things. One, to deal with all the different ways people want to use ESG data. I mean, some people will be reporting, but yet to be clear, there's going to be a product and market lens to this as well. So we're going to have to replay that data in different ways. But also really important to deal with, the way I consume ESG today is going to be very different than it is in a year's time. In 2, 3, 5 years' time, it's going to be unrecognizable. So we can't build rigid integration layers that are just not going to be cost effective for that changing environment. So I think that's going to be, if I was looking at this right now, as much as I was looking at the acquisition of data, I would be really focused on that data platform and how do I make that an effective platform to deal with change? Because I would be very paranoid if you don't get this right, you're going to build in high cost of change for the next 5 years. And that, in my mind, that would be a failure.
Yeah, I think completely aligned there, and thinking about this from a technology angle and a software as a service angle, would love to kind of throw that to Samantha. Keen to get your view on some of those initial challenges, Samantha, and what you've seen in the markets from a technology lens, and then also to get your view on, as Chris mentioned, this is a changing world, regulations are changing, we need to be adaptable. How can software, how can technology help banks be more agile?
Yeah, absolutely. So I echo Charmaine and Chris on both of their points. Charmaine's points around working without a set list of requirements in the data world is very challenging. Incorporating all types of data, dealing with data gaps, to Chris's points around flexible integration layers. Some of the key challenges we're finding on the software side at Palantir is threefold. So let me break it down into 3 parts. The first one would be the data engineering and the concept of pipelines behind this integration. And whilst the world, frankly, is working out both the data that's required here, as well as the standardization and the policy reforms, and of course the regulation, having those frameworks in place, having the plumbing in place for the water to flow through as and where it develops, and the floodgates open. I'll stop with the pun now. But at this point, we're finding that the very first step is truly in building the plumbing. And to Chris's point, it's actually it's a really new way for some parts of banks to work with data. It's really building up the concept of objects, if you like, or a digital twin of the organization based upon objects. So you're really taking a huge amount of information, both internally as well as leveraging as much external intelligence, especially in the ESG world, as we're going to have to do, but mapping that to things that make sense for users across the organization to actually make better decisions with that data. But the first step is in the plumbing, is in the data asset building, is in the pipelines. And we're finding that is absolutely the step one in translating the net zero and the ESG pathways into actionable financial decision making and risk mitigation and business impact. That's the first step. And then the second one would be about based upon agility and the concept of agility, and where software can enable that as well in simulation and scenario analysis. So ensuring, to your point earlier, Danny, it isn't in a vacuum. We're helping a lot of our partners in financial services ensure that any modeling or simulation or scenario analysis they are actioning and spending an awful amount of time, energy and effort doing so is actually based upon their own business and the portfolios, the transactions, the loan book at group level where necessary, all the way back down to transaction level, where you can simulate based upon future policy reform and also, of course, every other variable that one has to take into consideration in the ESG space. And you're able to enhance your internal information and proprietary data with external intelligence, where you're able to do those two things and to simulate effectively based upon this flexible data framework, and having operational tools where non-technical and technical users can actually make these decisions is absolutely key. And then the third one linked to that is building in feedback loops across the organization, where you can have SMEs across the org interact with data in a new way, but also capture the decisions they're making on a daily basis and feeding that back into a system, so that modeling in the future is genuinely based upon real-time feedback from users within the business as well as external factors.
Really interesting. Charmaine and Chris, can see you both kind of nodding along there. In terms of from a digital twin through to building up an ontology that's kind of agile, through to feedback loops. Is there any point there that you think are going to be particularly challenging for banks?
I think two things. I think there's a change in the paradigm of how we will build these platforms, which is going to not be brave makes it sound so much more heroic than I'm intending to mean it, but in terms of it's going to be bold for organizations to accept that change in the paradigm. So what I really liked, as Samantha was talking, I was thinking about all the mistakes organizations have made with reference data and instrument data and pricing. All those years ago has left us with quite a lot of problems now. And that's predominantly to the paradigm of I push data, push, and I send it out. And, the whole thing around the digital twins, the whole thing around scenario testing is actually bringing people back to the data. So the paradigm is provision of compute on data, not provision of data to you. And that's quite a fundamental operating model change as well as a technology change. And that is going to be challenging because that is not how organizations are designed to run now. And they are going to need to make those changes. Everything from, just the way people go around asking for data, all the way through to things like operationalizing, models, model testing outside of the quant space. That's really not something that is done at scale, industrialized in big organizations. So I think that's going to be a big change. So as much as it is technology, it's open approach. Maybe the best thing to say is there's a cultural change underneath there that needs to be part of this. And I actually always come back to people are the hardest thing to change. I mean, if we all just did it right, technology is easy, right? I know that's obviously not true. I'm being facetious here, but it's the people, hearts and mind thing, which I think we're going to have to spend some serious time on educating people on the new ways of working. How do we really approach this problem? How do we really change the actual delivery methodologies? And that I think is going to be the most challenging part, actually.
I think I tend to agree with you there from what we've seen in the market in terms of changing culture to work with data in different ways and really enabling different members of an organization at different technical skill levels to actually work with data and democratize the access of data, whether that's ESG data or operational data, to members of the front line, for example, who haven't jumped into analytical tools because they just haven't had the technology to do so. Charmaine, interested in your response to what Chris said there in terms of the kind of how this comes together, how we collectively resolve this in an organization that's going through this change kind of as we speak and over the last few years. How do you think we collectively resolve this? How are HSBC working towards this?
So I think that's sort of two questions. I think what we're doing within HSBC is the first question, and then the other question is what we could do as an industry or as a sort of a group of people who are passionate about data and stuff and technology. So I think in terms of HSBC, we saw this problem coming because HSBC is quite a large bank with lots of problems in terms with data and architecture, legacy infrastructure, And about towards the end of last year, we kind of foresaw this coming. I think at that time there was over 1,000 frameworks, and it was just chaos. So what we did was the first thing that we did was we appointed a single area, a single function solely dedicated to understanding ESG data. So what we did was we collected requirements around, and we started deduping, because once you have it in one area, rather than breaking down, you are effectively breaking down some of the silos that you mentioned earlier. So you're understanding the requirements, you're forming up what your definitions are. And what we then did was we then became, back to Chris's point, we then started forming some really agile delivery structures in the way that we deliver this, because things are always changing, requirements are always changing. And then also looking at our tech stack to see what we could do better and what we could innovate around this part. And the last thing that we did was we also started to change some of the culture and awareness of this to be able to, because ESG data is a little bit like the gold rush. Everyone's interested in ESG. Everyone is interested in ESG data, but you can't have this in silos. So to have one version of the truth is a very difficult concept when everyone is interested in it and everyone has an opinion. So it's also changing that awareness, the culture of it. So it's about the people, setting a function, understanding the requirements, getting that modular tech structures and really treating it like a better way of how we've dealt with any other data problem. And learning from our mistakes, of course. In terms of the second question, what we can do about it, I think back to what Chris was saying, we really need to start pushing the industry and pushing sort of regulators, vendors, everyone to start thinking about what is that common definition, that common taxonomy, that common framework that we're going to back. I know, for example, IFRS is doing something around this in this space as well, but we really need to start progressing that and really coming to that at an agreement in terms of how we can push this into a set of comprehensive standards for E, for S, and for G, and also how we can manage the changes in the evolution of that. So I think that is probably the first thing that we should do.
I think I tend to agree. I see Chris also agrees. In terms of that collaboration and coming together for standards, Chris, with regulators, how do you think we actually bring that to fruition? How have we seen that in other industries such as compliance, financial crime, where regulators and banks have come together? Is there any overlap there? Is there any learnings we can have?
I mean, first of all, I think the regulators are learning. I think, if we go back, I don't know, about 5 years ago now to the initial transaction reporting, it was very dictated out. And look, we've seen in the last year, the central bank, European Central Bank, and the Bank of England both issue papers on data collection. So it's definitely something they're listening to. I think that there's two kind of main things I think we need to do. I think one, the industry can't go back unless it forms its own view. So I think groups like the ESG working group within the EMEA are really important to form that view, and therefore we can go back with a view formed. I think that's really important. I think two, there is a broader engagement which is, I think, independent of ESG with regulators that needs to be on data collection, and I think those regulators are open to that conversation, and particularly are in Europe anyway. And I think it's important, particularly through things like data management, to engage them on the broader concepts of why it's important to have these. And I think if you can educate them on the broader concept of data collection, which at least in Europe they're open to, and then second of all, form, or in parallel, form that industry view that you can go back to, you can get on the front foot. I think what we don't want to be is on the back foot, where we are given items. I mean, my personal favorite example is always when I think about price notation. Many years ago, regulators asked in transaction reporting for something called price notation, which sounded like a really good idea, but it didn't exist in any bank. It's some things it's a price, some things it's a basis points, other things it's a fixed rate. And we were on the back for many years. We were on the back foot with the regulators trying to work that through. So I would recommend those two items. But I think the most important thing is if we don't have a viewpoint that is sensible, clear, articulate, well thought out, and also with enough people behind it to stand behind and engage regulators with, there's nothing for them to do with. So we have to form that view.
I'd just add, with regards to the regulators as well, one thing we're finding is the more software enables agility, the more it empowers users, the more it creates feedback loops. Of course, what regulators also want is governance, security, access controls, and auditability. And we're finding that is increasingly important because you just simply can't have one without the other. And one of the examples in the ESG world we're finding is that as and where you want to create the concept of ESG scorecarding, or you want to also empower end users who may be SMEs in the space to actually feedback their own knowledge, intelligence with regards to an industry, a corporate client, an investment portfolio, you're actually simulating the decision for someone in an authoritative capacity to then review the proposal of the change before implementing it into any sort of production workflow or any sort of decision-making work. And so this concept of simulating ahead of time, but with very strict access controls in place and also a full audit trail, these are things that I think will also continue to help the regulators in partnering rather than dictating as to how these standards need to be met and the frameworks we need to follow.
Yeah, I think we'd all agree with that. It's going to be interesting to see the journey that we go through and banks go through with the regulators in regards to ESG. I think now's probably a good time to pick up a few of the questions we've got from the audience. So we'll give this to whoever wants to take it first. But a question from Stuart Wallace here: is there a risk that data standards will restrict the degree of innovation our collective response to ESG will require? Maybe start, Charmaine.
So I think it depends on what we mean by data standards. So I think that we need some sort of data standards, but I think that separate to that, our data for ESG can be used for so many things. So we have clear definitions of what we mean by E, S, and G. We still can innovate in terms of product development. We can still innovate in terms of identifying what our insights are to our customers. And we can still definitely innovate in terms of how we manage our funds. So I think it really depends on what you mean by data standards. I think we need common definitions, but I don't necessarily think that we need clear standards in terms of quality standards or, stuff like that. Like really, as what Sam was saying, is, not dictating that, but actually allowing us to dictate or allowing us to suggest and then coming back with those ideas. And
Chris, anything to add there? Yeah. We've got another question.
All I would add is that without standards at the front, you add unnecessary complexity. And, I'm a pragmatist. Complexity doesn't get easier as you go through a bank. It escalates in complexity. And that escalation in complexity ends up resulting in armies of bodies of people cleaning stuff up, the lack of slowness and speed to get things done. So I think standards at the front are absolutely mission critical for us to allocate resource correctly as we go through the chain to innovate. Otherwise, we're just going to have armies of people doing low value cleanup activities to deal with that complexity, which will only get worse. It will never get better. So that's the only way I look at it, maybe.
And I'll just add one thing before we move on to the next question. I'll be quick, Danny, I promise, which is an example of where you can actually innovate until we even meet the standards. And we're helping a couple of our large FS partners in creating a more collaborative approach to data collection in order to meet the standards, whereby those on the loan desk and the ESG function, risk and compliance, can actually interact with a single view of a corporate client or a transaction in a truly new way, based upon both the operational tooling that Danny mentioned earlier, as well as access controls that need to be there, but this kind of object-driven strategic data asset level as well, and they can start to collaborate and truly kind of weave through and cut through data in different ways that they may not have done before with this purpose in mind until we reach standardization. So it's certainly a double-edged sword, but silver lining as well.
Thanks. And one question, Sam, that's probably for myself or you. I'll let you take this one. Focused on software and Foundry. So, is a user's limited access to data, and I'm assuming here we're meaning that non-standardized, disparate ESG data unique to Palantir's system, Foundry, which we know and love, or have other data platform or other systems or other architectural setups also, do they have a similar way to filter or integrate data on a table or field level?
Yeah, I can take that, and then of course we'd love to hear everyone else's thoughts. From a Palantir Foundry perspective, the unique value that we tend to find in the work that we do in financial services is we're coming in with the humility, understanding that banks have spent years and an awful amount of time and effort building up a fantastic foundation to start with. And then where Palantir Foundry can truly help is in integrating the trickier stuff like the non-standardized or the unstructured, as well as the engineering work that goes into operationalizing AI, for instance. And to Chris's point earlier, how do you ensure your models are built upon as reactive and real-time information as you can, and decision capture across the business? How can you build tools for non-technical users to work with data in a way that previously maybe only data scientists could work with the data? So I think the unique value, or what we're finding anyway with Foundry, from to the question around data structure and the challenges around the integration, it's not just the integration piece that is unique. It's the what can you do with it once you have it both structured and unstructured across the business? How do you map it to something strategic? How do you simulate upon those objects? And then how do you empower end users to work with it differently and capture those decisions? So it's kind of almost a full stack. Obviously, Palantir Foundry is full stack, but it's a full stack process from start to finish, from the very ingestion of the raw data through to the very end of the decision capture feedback.
Thanks very much for that, Sam. And we are going to have to wrap up now very quickly, though, on the Palantir offering that Samantha actually just talked us through. What we're really aiming to do at Palantir is enable our different customer organizations to make better decisions with data, whether this is focused around ESG or focused around any of their other kind of asset lines or finance, asset management, customer lending or risk. There's kind of some core components to our software, from software-defined data integration, model orchestration, scenario analysis, to that actionability and operational tooling we were discussing earlier to actually get that data and the insight into the hands of users. So once again, a huge thank you to Samantha, Chris, and Charmaine for joining the panel. It's been a pleasure to host, and thank you for everyone for viewing.
Thank you for having us. Bye, everyone.